Okay, hi everyone. Good evening. Thanks for showing up on a Tuesday. No, today's Tuesday, right? My week is already blurring. It's a Tuesday evening. I'm Debbie Schwartz, founder of Road to College and the Paying for College 101 group, and I'm here tonight with Kelly Frindell, who is going to talk to us about the PSAT. And Kelly also has been tutoring and doing test preparation with students for 20 years, Kelly? I don't want to.
Yep, about 22 years.
Okay. And her company is called InHouse Test Prep. So we will talk more about that. Let me just tell you a little bit about housekeeping tonight, about how we run the session. This is a meeting as opposed to a webinar. So if you want to, you can put your video on, which is always nice to see people's faces, but it's best if you could keep yourself muted so we don't hear any background noise. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll be monitoring them. And I'd love to, if anybody can share with us what year their student is in high school. If their student has started any test prep, that would be great to know. What state you're from. Kelly and I were talking right before we got on, and she actually, and I'll let you expand on this, said that this is actually a great time to be talking about the PSAT. I know some people are thinking, this is too early. Why are they talking about the PSAT? Actually, Kelly will explain more why we're talking about it. Last year, we actually did a session on the PSAT after the PSAT scores came out. That was helpful for like the students who had just taken the PSAT so they can understand their score, but less helpful for helping them prepare because you only have limited number of shots of when you can take the PSAT. So hopefully you will find tonight's information very helpful. And I see I love it when I see somebody who's a freshman in high school. So that's great timing to be coming and preparing. Definitely, obviously a sophomore too. Yeah, nice to see you early bird people getting started on this type of stuff. I'll tell you one other thing Kelly and I talked about before we got on, when we mentioned a lot of people maybe don't realize it's worth talking about the PSAT now. They'll say it's too early. And Kelly and I both kind of joked a little bit that we are always on so many of these topics related to college admissions are encouraging people to start early, whether you get help or not, whether you just yourself to start understanding the process. And I'd say a fair number of times we get pushback. Oh, it's too early. Oh, honestly, I had one woman who wrote me and said, you're just purposely scaring us, which is really not the case. And then on the flip side, particularly this time of year, I cannot tell you how many comments, how many emails I get from parents that say, I wish I had known this information earlier. I wish I had found your site earlier. I wish I had, signed up for your services earlier. So it's kind of like, both sides. It's the classic, you don't know what you don't know until you go through it. And then once you go through it, you're like, oh boy, I really wish I knew that stuff earlier and had started earlier. So, but all you people who are here tonight, you are starting at a good time. So Kelly, do you mind sharing a little bit about yourself, your background, and then we'll get going with your slides?
Sure. So as Debbie mentioned, I do teach test prep. I own a business called InHouse Test Prep, and I've been teaching test prep for about 22 years. And I work with students on the SAT, the ACT, and PSAT, and I also help kids with boarding schools and private schools for some of the younger kids. And I do mostly individual and mostly online since the pandemic started, and we've been in these last few years. And I really like talking about the PSAT because it's a topic that people say to me all the time. They say, well, why should I study for the PSAT? Why should I care? It's not important for anything, or does it matter? And like everything, there are nuances to the PSAT. For some people, it may not matter as much as it does for other people, but it does have some important things associated with it. So I do think it's useful to know about it and to be prepared. And like Debbie said, it is better to start now than to wait till later because time will come up very quickly, and now is a great time to be thinking about it. So I do have some slides to go over, and if you do have questions, you can put them in the chat. Debbie may read some of them as we go, and then we will also do some questions at the end as well. Let me grab my slides. Let's see. So good. And before we get into the whole presentation, I do want to tell you a little bit about the PSAT because it has changed in the last year or so. It did go digital, just like the SAT. The first administration of the digital PSAT was given last year. So this upcoming fall will be the second time that this test has been given. And the format is different than it was before they took it digital. What it looks like now is there will be two reading and writing sections, and there will be two math sections. And on the reading and writing sections, they cover reading comprehension type questions. There's also grammar questions, so things like punctuation, word choice. And then there are also quite a few vocabulary questions. Those ones are new. A long time ago, there was vocabulary on the PSAT. They took it off. Now they have put it back on there. And some students are surprised by that because it hasn't been on previous versions of the test, but it is there now. And then with the math questions, the content for the math covers arithmetic, so kind of basic arithmetic, algebra 1, geometry. There is no algebra 2 or any pre-cal on the PSAT. There is on the SAT, but not for PSAT. And one of the interesting features about the digital test is it's what is called section adaptive. And what that means is the sections adapt. There's two different modules for the reading and writing, the two for the math. And what will happen is students will get the same module 1, and that one is a mixture of easy, medium, and hard questions. And depending on how your child does on that section, they will either be shuttled into an easier second section or a harder second section. And so in that way, it's adapting to their level, but not by question, it's by section. And you do want to get to that harder unit because those questions tend to be worth more than the easier questions. And College Board is not very forthcoming right now with how the scoring works exactly, but that's typical for adaptive tests that you do want to get to the harder ones because you do tend to get more points for those. And sometimes I see in the group, sometimes in the Facebook group, that people will post, well, this is really unfair. People are getting different tests. It's not standardized. But adaptive tests, there's a lot that goes into those with measurements and statistics, and they have whole teams who do things. And basically, the purpose of an adaptive test is to get you more quickly to your actual score. And so students that are higher scores don't have to waste their time with easier questions. Students who are on the lower end of scoring don't have to waste their time with questions they're not likely to get right. And so that is what the test will look like. And typically, most juniors will end up taking the PSAT. Some sophomores take it. It's increasingly more common that sophomores will take it, and sometimes freshmen will take it too. A lot of it just depends on your school and what's offered, but junior year is really the main time that people take it. And if you're wondering why it does matter, there's a couple of different reasons why it's important. So for sophomores who take the test, and same for freshmen too, if you take it during your freshman year, it's really just a time to practice taking a standardized test. And for many students, sometimes this is the first big high stakes test that they've taken for a standardized test. And it's not really high stakes for freshmen and sophomores because it doesn't technically count for anything, but it is practice for taking SAT and ACT and the PSAT later in junior year, which we'll talk about in a minute while that's important. So there's the practice aspect of it. The really big reason, though, is for juniors who take it, is it's the first step when you get your scores to qualifying for the National Merit Scholarship Program. And that's typically when people talk about why PSAT is important. That tends to be the reason. But what people don't know is that besides the National Merit, the official National Merit Scholarship Program, some private scholarships also use PSAT scores, and some colleges also offer their own merit aid based on PSAT scores. So there can be merit money tied into these test scores. And when you are looking at your test scores or your child's test scores, there's 3 different pieces of information that you'll see on the score sheet. You'll get an individual score for each of the different sections, and those individual scores range from 160 to 760. So you'll get a reading and writing, you'll get a math one. And then composite score is those 2 scores added together. Those range from 320 to 1520. And then there's the index score. Index score is a little complicated and weird, but the way that you get the index score is you double the reading and writing score you add the math score, and then you divide by 10. It's basically its own SAT problem in there. And index scores range from 48 to 228, and those tend to be what's important when you're talking about potentially qualifying for national merit scholarships. And this is an example of what a score report will look like. And I know the writing on there is a little bit small. I couldn't quite make it any bigger. But over on the left-hand side, that 1120, that's a total score. So that is a combination of the 620 and 550 that you see there. So this student got a 620 on reading and writing, which was in the 60th percentile, and they scored a 500 on the math, which was in the 70th percentile. And then if you look over,
Go ahead.
if you
Sorry,
look
Kelly.
over to the right, where it says NMSC Selection Index 174, that's the index score. And the way that they got that, again, they doubled this reading score. 620 is 1240. They added the 500, that's 1740, chopped off the 0, oops, to divide by 10, and came up with 174. This information in the middle gives a generalized breakdown of how the student did on the various sections. Unfortunately, this score report that is out right now for the current version of the PSAT is not super helpful because it's not very specific. What this is showing, so if you look under reading and writing, the first heading says information and ideas. It says it was 26% of the test section, 12 to 14 questions, and this person apparently got all of them right. So, okay, that's useful to know. But the next category, it says it was 28% of the test section, 13 to 15 questions, and they got this number of bars right out of that. But that is not an actual number of questions. It is a generalized percent. We don't know how many questions it was, how many exactly they got right or wrong. So it will give you a general idea, but unfortunately it is not as useful as it could be. And my friends and I in the test prep world, we're really hoping they will change that so it is more useful in the future.
So Kelly, so does that mean on the index, since they double the reading and writing section,
Mhm.
basically it's more like that influences the index much
Yes.
more?
Mhm.
And I
Yes.
guess, yeah, I can't remember if you have a slide, but you haven't explained really, or will you, how the index is used?
We'll get there in a
Okay.
minute. Yes. So we'll talk about why the index score is important in just a moment. And as to why the reading and writing is heavily weighted that way, who knows? They're not really very transparent about why that is. It's a decision that was made somewhere along the line. It's just the way it is. Yeah, it is more heavily weighted that way. And when you're trying to figure out what a good score is on the PSAT, because I hear that a lot too. Oh, well, is this a good score? Is this a bad score? Here's some information just to give you kind of a benchmark for different scores. So for juniors who take the test, a score of 1,000, so that's the reading and writing added together, is around the 50th percentile. Once you hit 1270, that is about 90th percentile, and then scores between 1270 and 1520 go all the way. As you get closer to the 1400s, 1500s, that gets into the high 90 and 99th percentile. For sophomores, the scores are a little bit different. 900 is 50th percentile, and 1170 is where top 10% starts. That's about 90th percentile. And so if your child has taken the test already, you can compare their scores to these ranges to see kind of if it's a strong score, if it's a medium-ish score, or if it might be a little bit on the lower side. And in terms of the National Merit Scholarship Program, which generally is the reason this test is important, what it is it's an annual competition for both recognition and scholarships. And there are 3 types of scholarships that you can receive through this program. You can receive the one that is officially called National Merit, and it's a one-time $2,500 award. Then there are some corporate sponsored scholarships, which have specific criteria, and these are given by specific companies. And the criteria might be that your parent works for their organization, or that you want to study a particular industry, or you want to go into a certain area. And then there are also some that are college sponsored, which means they come directly from the college. And when you go through the National Merit scholarship process, which we'll talk about in a minute, you are required to list them as your first choice in order to qualify for them. And in terms of how to win a National Merit Scholarship, and this is where the index score comes into play, there are a whole bunch of steps for it. And what people tend to think is just if you score a certain score on your PSAT, you win. And I used to think that too until I got much deeper into this process and realized it's actually a really long process with a lot of steps. So the first thing that happens is after everybody has taken it, the College Board will release what they call a national index cutoff score. And so we talked about those index scores earlier. In 2022, the index score happened to be 207. And each state has their, so that's the national one. Each state also has their own index score. And so the first step is you have to meet the national one, and then you also have to meet the score in your state. And they do vary by state. In 2022, the scores varied between 207 and 224. And if you're curious where your state falls, you can Google just your state name and National Merit State Index score, and you'll find some information about the last couple of years as well as other states, so you can see, oh, am I in a high state or am I in a low state? And my understanding is that is to help account for differences in education and income levels and just various differences in education among the states. So if you meet the national criteria and then you meet your state criteria, the next step is you have to complete an application. And then besides the application, there are also several other criteria that you have to meet. You have to have a good academic record, so high GPA. You have to write an essay. You need a recommendation by a school official. And then you need what's called a confirmatory score on an SAT or an ACT. And what that is basically is they want you to take an SAT or an ACT and prove that your PSAT scores weren't a fluke. And the numbers change each year, but in general, for the SAT, you need around a 1320. For ACT, you need around a 26. And if you scored high enough on the PSAT to meet those index scores, it's likely you shouldn't have a problem scoring those types of scores on the SAT or ACT. In terms of the likelihood of getting these scholarships, here's some of the numbers. So typically about 1.3 million students will take the test. And out of those, about 50,000 high scorers will get recognition, and they'll say, okay, good job, you scored well on this test. Out of those 50,000, 34,000 will become what's called commended scholars. And commended scholars are a little bit below the index score. And basically what they say is, congratulations, you did a good job on this test. You might get a certificate or something for it, but there's no money that's involved with it. And those 34,000 are now basically done. They are not applicable to continue on with the process. 16,000 people would become semifinalists, and that's based on those index scores. And then those people will have the opportunity to complete the application, to do all those extra steps that we talked about. And about 15,000 of those 16,000 will become the finalist. And then out of those, about 8,000 will receive the $2,500 scholarship. And this is the one that's specifically from the National Merit Competition. So it's not a lot, but there are people who will qualify for that. What is also surprising about this process is it takes a really long time. So here's kind of a general timeline of how this will work. If your child's a junior, they'll take the test October of their junior year. Scores come back usually around November. Sometimes the schools don't release them till December or so, but you should have them before Christmas or winter break. Then there is a very long wait until September of senior year. And that's when the semifinalists will be notified. And then that's the time the applications get sent out. People can decide if they want to proceed. In February, the finalists are notified. And then it is not until May of your senior year that the winners are actually announced. So this process takes from October of your junior year till May of your senior year. It's a very long time. Yes, and that has always been shocking to me too. I'm not sure why it takes so long, but that is the process. And so this is part of why it's good to think ahead, because there's a long road ahead of you for this. But the steps are very clear and the timeline is very clear too for it. Besides the national merit ones, there are also school-based merit scholarships that can be based on PSAT scores. And this has changed a little bit over the years. Like when I went to school, which was in the 90s, national merit was a big deal. And there were a lot of schools that offered full rides, full tuition, full everything. And then over the years, that has changed quite a bit. And a lot of schools don't offer that same kind of award anymore. And in fact, some schools won't even offer any recognition to national merit scholars at all because they're competitive enough that they don't really need to do it. But there are still a number of schools that do offer nice, compelling scholarships for national merit people. There are still some that offer full rides, some full tuition. Some schools will offer one-time awards. I know my sister, when she was applying, I think at Rice, and this was also early 2000s, she got offered a $500 one-time award for that. So some of them are a little more compelling than others, and some don't do it at all. But it is an option, and it's worth looking into to see. And it's not always super clear that they do, so you may have to go looking for that information on the school site. In terms of how to use your scores to guide you as to what to do, there's a couple of different things to consider. So if you take this test as a sophomore or as a freshman too, generally I would recommend you don't need to spend a lot of time studying for a freshman or a 10th grade test. And in fact, I don't really recommend spending all that much time at all on it unless some students do need the reassurance of knowing what it is that they're walking into. If that's the case, I think it's fine to do a little bit of preparing to say, okay, here's what's on it, here's what to expect, here's the general way to deal with it. That's fine. But I don't recommend spending a lot of time on it. But what is important is the information that you receive from those scores. So if you're a sophomore who has taken the test, and if your index score is around 200, it can be plus or minus a little bit, but if it's around that general area, that means you have a chance possibly to be a national merit scholar. And in that case, I would highly recommend that you do plan to study for your junior year PSAT. And so sophomores right now, this is why it's important to be thinking about it right now, because now is the time to start studying. Generally late spring, early summer, gives you a runway of a few months. And sometimes people are saying it's May, October is a really long way away. Yes and no, October will be here very, very quickly. And after finals and summer vacation and summer plans, and then the beginning of school, it'll be October pretty much next week. So I would recommend that if you think you might qualify, start thinking about it now so that you can plan over the summer and be ready for that October test.
So, Kelly, can I ask, there was somebody who had a question that their student took a ACT in 10th grade. And so they're wondering, and they didn't say, but I'm assuming that they might be happy with the score that they got as in their ACT. Are they wondering if they still should take the PSAT in this coming fall? And do they need to prep differently because they basically prepped for the ACT previously?
Yes. Okay. So as to the question of whether you should take the PSAT, I would recommend yes, that you go ahead and do that because the ACT won't help you any in the PSAT process because they're different companies and they're different tests. And most schools just set it up so that your kid takes it anyway. So there's a good chance they may do it as well. I mean, anyhow. So separate processes for those. And then the preparation is different because a lot of the content overlaps. So the math skills and the grammar skills and the way that you approach reading questions, those are very similar. But the PSAT is pretty different than the ACT now. They used to be much more similar, and now they've kind of diverged again, and the strategies are different. And so the preparation that your child did for the ACT will help them, but I would recommend that they also do some specific PSAT prep as well, because it just is a different test with different ways to approach it.
Kelly, there are a few questions. I don't know if you don't mind going back to that slide with the timing of when, okay. So somebody is asking if you already know your scores by December, if you know your PSAT scores by December, when does the index come out?
The index score, I believe, comes out around that time. So you'll know if you have met it before September happens. And
That's what they're
so
wondering, if they'll kind of know if a little earlier, if their student might
I
qualify
believe
as a
so, yes.
semifinalist. Okay.
Yeah. And in general, you can also look, there are a lot of companies that put out predictions of what they think the scores are going to be for each state based on data from other years. That is not entirely scientific, but you can look to see. I think Compass Prep is one that does one, and you can look to see. Another good way is to look to see what last year's index score was for your state, and that can at least give you a hint if your child is close or not.
And do you have
So
more
yeah.
information about like how finalists are chosen from the semifinalist
So
cohort?
those application materials that they've submitted, so their essay, their
So
recommendation,
it's based
and
on
all
just
of the
the application. Okay.
yes.
Okay, just another question. Can the student take the PSAT on their own as a sophomore, or does their school, they have to take it through their school?
Generally, you have to take it through your school. It's rare that you can take it somewhere else because generally they're given on either a Wednesday or on a Saturday. Some schools have in-school test dates, and some schools do them on the weekends, and it depends on just logistic factors for the different schools. So typically, you do have to take it at your school. The general exceptions are if you are a homeschooling student, that you generally can contact a school. You can usually contact the principal and ask if your student can come take the test there. Or occasionally, if you have missed the test for a good reason, if you were registered and you were sick or injured or ill or whatever, occasionally you can go take it at another school, but it's unusual to be able to do it.
Go ahead. Sorry to mess. With-
Yeah, so it's unusual to be able to take it somewhere else unless there's extenuating circumstances, which tend to be homeschooling or you weren't able to take it for a valid reason.
Okay, one last question, then we'll go on.
Mhm.
But it's just a lot of it related to this timeline.
Yeah.
So will students know anything about their status from the PSAT that can actually be used on college applications? Will they know it in time? I mean, they'll know whether they're semifinalists.
Yeah,
I guess.
yeah, they typically won't know that they won because that information doesn't happen until May, which is too late for most college applications,
Right. Right.
which is unfortunate. But potentially they will know that they are a semifinalist, so they can definitely put that on their application. And that has importance too, even if you don't end up with officially as a national merit person, to say you're a semifinalist is an honor, and that is something that can boost your application as well.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, good questions. Thank you. Let's see. So we were talking about what to do with this information once you have it. So if you're a junior, if you have a score that seems to reasonably be in the area of your state index, make sure if you have not taken the SAT or ACT that you do plan to take it so that you can get that confirming score. Because you don't want to be scrambling at the end and be like, oops, I need to take this test really quick. And if you have not started your prep for those, it's time to start pretty soon for SAT and ACT. Fall of junior year is a fine time to start. I would not wait, probably early winters to early spring of junior year is the latest that I would wait to begin with those. And then on the opposite side of this spectrum, if your score is low or your child's score is low, that's also important information too, because what that tells you is there may be some gaps in knowledge that can be remediated. Even if your child doesn't decide to take the SAT later on or they don't take the ACT, if you're under about 1,000 or so, that does say, hey, there may be some gaps in math skills or in grammar skills or in reading skills. And that's important to know because if there are problems now, I always say school just gets harder as you go along. And if you wait, things are never going to get easier. So it's easier to fix stuff now than later on when school is harder or when your child gets to college. So if there is some issue going on, you might want to seek out a tutor, or you might want to have an evaluation done, or just make sure in some way that your child is is where they need to be. The other thing to consider is if you are a low score on the PSAT, that may be an indication that the ACT might be a better test to take if your child is going to take an SAT or an ACT for admissions. And the PSAT and the SAT are very similar to each other. So if your child scored fairly low on the PSAT, there's a good chance they may score similarly on the SAT as well. Things to think about. In terms of preparing, there's a lot of different ways that you can prepare for the PSAT. One of the best ways is using the College Board's Blue Book app. And this is an app that you can download from their website. I don't believe it's an app that you can do from like the App Store. You do go to College Board site and download it. And this has got practice tests on it. There are not very many PSAT practice tests. It is okay if you run through those ones to work on some of the SAT material as well. SAT is a little bit harder than PSAT, so there will be things on there that will not necessarily be on the PSAT, but it won't hurt you to do it. And it's good to use official material, which means it comes from the source, from the test makers, to practice with. And especially for this new test, we're all flying a little bit blind right now because there's not very much material out there from the College Board. There's a handful of practice tests, some practice sets, and that's about it. So use as much official material as you can, and then move on to other sources. And some of those other sources, Khan Academy is a great one, and they actually partner with College Board. So any of them, their material is fine to use. They have self-paced options to walk you through the different sections and to practice. You can also try out group classes. And my caveat for group classes is if you sign your child up for a group class, make sure you're really being honest about whether your child will benefit from a class like this or not. Because what tends to happen in these group classes, they're long. A lot of times they're 2 to 3 hours at a time. Sometimes they have mixed levels, and a lot of times people end up not paying very much attention to them. So if you know your child is somebody who's going to focus and do well in it, group classes can be a really good option. If you know they are not going to focus, I would recommend trying a different option, especially if the group classes are online, because you can have online options, you can have in person. Online for a lot of kids are really hard. It's really hard for them to pay attention for that many hours in these classes. Private tutoring is also an option, and private tutoring can be done just with your child, sometimes in small groups. Sometimes you might have your child work with a friend, with a tutor. And I have a bias towards this one because it's what I do for a living. But what I would say is if you're considering private tutoring, make sure you're doing your due diligence about that as well. Because one of the kind of scary things about the tutoring industry is that it's not regulated at all, and there's no licensing board, there's no exam we have to take. Anybody can be a tutor, and anybody can say that they're a test prep tutor. And I've been at this a long time, and I know that there are people who just put out their metaphorical shingle and they're like, yeah, I teach SAT because maybe they helped their child or they've taught a little bit of it at school or something. And there really are differences between individual tutors. So if you're thinking about using an individual tutor, what I would recommend, word of mouth and recommendations and personal referrals is a really good way to find somebody. Ask your friends, ask your child's friends' parents if they've used somebody, because parents will tell you if they know somebody's good, they'll let you know. And they'll let you know too if somebody is not good at something. And also I'd recommend that you have your child meet with them and maybe with you. I always do an introductory meeting to make sure everything's a good fit, because somebody can be a very good tutor and still just not be a good personality match with your child. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just we're all different. So make sure that's a good match. And that you're getting somebody who really knows what they're doing. Make sure they have a lot of experience as well. So find out what their background is, how long they've been doing it, and make sure too that they do all sections of the test that your child is studying for, because some tutors will only do just math or just reading, and try to find somebody who does all of them together. And then other options, self-study is always an option. And this one, I have mixed feelings about, because there are some students who genuinely can self-study. They're motivated, they have the skills to sit down with a big giant book and teach themselves the material and work through it. honestly, that is not very many students. And so again, here's a good place for self-reflection or reflection about your child. If you know that if you give them a big giant book that they're going to put it under the bed and never look at it, this is probably not a good way to go. The other thing that's really challenging with trying to study by yourself is that it's hard to know what's important. And if you look at test prep books, like the ACT book that's out right now, it's about this big. It's around 1,100 pages. And the SAT book for the old version was 1,300 pages. And most students don't need to know everything in that book. They only need to know what's important for them to be able to do well at the level that they can perform. And what's really interesting about tests like these is you don't actually have to know all of the material. Most students, for students who are trying to get close to perfect scores, yes, they do. Everybody else, they don't need to worry about those very, very hard questions that very few people will get right. They need to worry about the questions that they are likely to get right. And that's something that's hard to know on your own because there's no reason that you would know that. But that is an option as well. And if you do get your scores back and they're low, there, again, like we talked about before, there's information in that. So here's what I say about that. If your score's low, the first most important thing is don't panic. There's time to fix things. There's time to work on this. One of the most important things to do is really to go back to the basic skills and make sure you know your basic math skills and you know your basic grammar skills. And this is something that I have seen a lot, especially in the last 4 years since all of the pandemic things going on. A lot of these skills have been lost or they were never taught to begin with. And I'm seeing now with my students that things they knew 4 or 5 years ago, they don't right now. So people often don't know how to use basic formulas in math or how to use commas or semicolons or even things like vocabulary as well. And so going backwards to pick up some of those earlier skills is going to be really important because you can't do higher level skills without the basics. It's also really important to make a plan for studying. And this is true whether you have a low score or you have a higher score. If you don't have a plan, it's going to be really hard to improve your score in any meaningful way. And so what making a plan looks like, here's what I usually recommend for my students is after you've taken your PSAT, if you're looking ahead to SAT or ACT, pick out a test date, sign up for it. And that's really important right now, especially because a lot of test sites don't have, or a lot of schools aren't offering the test as often as they used to be. And people are really struggling to find test sites to take an SAT or an ACT. So you know you're planning to take one of those, get signed up for it, and then work backwards from there to figure out when you should start studying. So if you know you have a test in October, and that could be PSAT or it could be SAT or ACT, work backwards to think, okay, I need 3 months to plan for this. I'm going to start in this month and then make a specific plan for what you're going to do. Maybe say on Mondays and Wednesdays, I'm going to spend an hour from 4 to 5, and I'm going to work on math on Mondays and I'm going to work on reading on Wednesdays, and put it in your calendar and then sit down and do it. Because if you don't plan for it, what tends to happen is that life gets in the way. There's always something else that feels more important at the time. Other tests will come up, school tests, friends, activities, sports, holidays, movies, you name it. There will always be a reason not to study for this stuff. So having a plan is the first important part to being able to improve. And then also just not to try to go it alone. This is a big process. There's a lot of anxiety sometimes that goes into this, into studying. And if you're a student, if you are feeling overwhelmed with it, make sure you do ask for help. You can go to your parents, you can go to a teacher or somebody at your school and say, hey, I need some help with this. Where do I go? What should I do about it? Because we don't have to do anything alone. And that's what I got. What do we have questions about? And we can talk about PSAT if you have, I think we have some time. If you have PSAT or, excuse me, SAT or ACT questions, we could probably throw some of those in there too.
Well, Kelly, I know you kind of just mentioned it at the end, but somebody said, do you have any advice for a student who suffers from test anxiety? Actually, Kelly, I did a session with her about, I don't know, last month, on all about test anxiety. I'm going to put that link. It's a recording that's now on YouTube in the chat, but do you have anything to just summarize, kind of what advice you could give to the parents of students that have, who think they have test anxiety?
Mhm. Yeah, so this is something I also like to talk a lot about because I've been hearing a lot from both my students and from their parents, a lot more than I used to, that their child has test anxiety or a student says to me, I have test anxiety. And what's important to know is a lot of times what feels like test anxiety actually isn't. And so sometimes people are quick to pathologize themselves. They're like, I have this thing. And what it really is, instead of test anxiety, it's an anxiety about a test that is hard. And that actually is very normal. And what I am also seeing is that often what feels like anxiety is actually a mismatch in skills ability. And so I spoke a moment ago about not having some of those basic skills. And students, by and large, do not have the skills they need right now to take these tests. And that itself is causing a tremendous amount of anxiety when they go to take these tests because they're being put in a situation where they do not have the skills to succeed. And of course, that is going to cause anxiety. And so sometimes the remediation for test anxiety is actually go back to basics and make sure you have those skills that you need. And beyond that, if there are some strategies that are similar to dealing with any type of anxiety, some of them are physical ways to deal with it. Make sure you're exercising, that you're eating well, you're getting enough rest. You can do relaxation exercises. You can find plenty of them on YouTube, or breathing deeply. And then there are also cognitive ways to deal with some of that anxiety. And a lot of it is really just thought stopping. So when you hear yourself starting to spiral, say stop and redirecting that thought. And noticing when you're starting to get into negative self-talk. If you start thinking, I'm terrible at this, I can never do this, I'm never going to get a good score, and I'm not going to get a job, and I'll be out on the street, and I'll die alone, to really redirect those thoughts and go, no, this is challenging, but I'm capable of doing it. I will get the score that I need. I'll be able to be successful in life, and things like that. And some of them sound very simple, but they are actually very effective techniques for anxiety and any kind of anxiety, including test anxiety.
Kelly, there's a question about PSAT scores and like athletic recruiting. Do you know anything about, are the scores used at all, particularly because, the recruiting starts earlier and if a student has taken it, then they might have that score as opposed to yet their SAT or ACT?
Yes. So I will give the caveat that I don't actually do the admission side of things. And so this is my answer that I have heard anecdotally from other people. My understanding is that, yes, sometimes schools will use them in lieu of SAT or ACT scores when they have started the recruiting process early. I don't know a lot more than that because, again, it's not my area, but I have heard that.
Another question that somebody's asking, if a sophomore has a score that is just below the top 10%, how much do you think that they should study to qualify for the national merit?
So rather than the percentile rank, I would look more at the index score. And so that 200-ish mark on the index score, that's kind of the range where test prep people will say, yeah, it's probably worth it. And if they're like 197 or 195, that's probably close enough. If they're at 182, that's a pretty big difference than 200. And so that's the score that I would look at more. And it's a judgment call. There's no hard and fast rule about, yep, it's definitely worth it, definitely not. But 200 is kind of what my friends in the test prep arena all say they look forward to.
Okay, so what's the difference on the PSAT between the English writing section versus the SAT?
So there's not much difference between those ones. The SAT and the PSAT are pretty similar on the reading and writing sections. The math is different though, in that PSAT does not have the Algebra 2 or the pre-cal. And there is a little bit difference in difficulty level, but not much difference in terms of the types of questions for the reading and writing.
You kind of mentioned this, but maybe you can say it again. There's a question about my 9th grader who's taking the ACT in June. It will be her first time to see her baseline without studying. Do you think that that's the right thing to do, that she should take it without any studying?
So I do always recommend that people get a baseline score, and there's a couple of ways to do that. You can take an official test, which it sounds like she's doing. You can also take a practice test and to find out the same information. And a practice test is just one that you do at home. The ACT offers one on their website. That's the one I always recommend that you do. It's a PDF that you can download. There aren't a whole lot of drawbacks to taking it in ninth grade just to try it out and see. The only caveat to that is there are a handful of schools, and I know that Georgetown is one of them. There's a couple other ones that do that require you to submit all test scores. Most schools don't, but there are a few that do. So if you think you might be looking at a school like Georgetown, just know that she may have to submit it at some point. For most people, though, it's not a problem to do it. And I think it's fine to take it with no preparation because that also is information, and that tells you likely kind of where your child is starting out, what they need to work on, how long they may need to work on it, and also gives you some information about what schools, what types of schools to start looking at as well.
Okay, we don't have any more questions. We actually answered them all.
Oh,
I'll give everybody a chance if there's any other questions you want to put into the chat. But hopefully you found this helpful, worthwhile. I'm also love to know. I mean, this is again not meant to pressure people to feel like they, have to start early. Although hopefully you can see that if you do start early, even just learning the deadlines, the process, it will help you and make a difference. So hopefully, you got that out of it. And I guess I will apply the starting early in testing is extremely helpful. And I will translate that into starting early in understanding your budget and what your family can afford, and college costs is also important. And eventually the test scores, the PSAT, the SAT scores will start to collide with the costs of college, because it can help your student get those merit scholarships, which will reduce your family's overall cost. So let me just see if there was one.
yeah. And the one thing I want to piggyback on what Debbie just said is that with test scores, besides money, test scores also increase options as well, because obviously the higher scores that you get, it opens more doors to different types of schools that your child may not have been considering, or it may give them an advantage. And it is a very confusing time right now in the college world. I know all of it is confusing, but especially with the issue about taking tests or not. And there's been this movement towards test optional, but a lot of schools are now going back to it. And in fact, today, some of the Georgia schools said they're going back to requiring tests. And if your child is a freshman or a sophomore this year, who knows what's going to be happening in the next year or two? A lot of things could change. And so taking tests, being prepared for them, even if your child eventually doesn't end up using them, it does provide options. And I'm always happy for more options rather than fewer options.
So one last question, Kelly. Somebody is asking, their student hasn't taken, they're going to be a junior. They haven't
Okay.
taken any, sample SATs, ACTs. They didn't take the PSAT before. How do they know if they should like study now and potentially prepare for the fall's PSAT? And is there still enough time?
Okay, so no tests have been taken. Sophomore right now, about to be a junior.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. What I would recommend is go to College Board site, download their Blue Book app, and take one of the practice tests there, and they see what the score is there, and that should give you some information if they're even close to in the ballpark or not really. And if it's not really anywhere close, I probably wouldn't worry too much about it. And again, like we talked about, if it's kind of edging up towards that 200-ish range, then I'd say yes, probably worth it.
And what about in terms of, is there enough time?
Time to study, yes. So we're in May right now. That test is in October. And typically now till June, July-ish is when I recommend starting. So yeah, plenty of time to still do it.
And so what is like the minimum amount of time that somebody should keep in mind if their student wants to prep? Is it 3 months?
So 2 to 3 months is generally what I would say as a minimum. If there's time to do more, great. I probably wouldn't do much less than that. And some of that also depends to where your child is starting out and what their what you have a sense of their natural abilities are too. Because if they're just right on the edge, they probably want to do more. If you know they're a very, very high scorer already and they're going to be a high scorer, then maybe not as much.
So somebody is asking, I'm not quite sure what they say, do you recommend Cliff Notes? I don't know if Cliff Notes has something for test prep.
I'm not sure if they do for any of these tests.
Yeah.
Possibly for the AP test. I don't know.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kelly, so much. Thank you, everybody who showed up and learned about this tonight. We will send a follow-up email with the recording and more information if anybody wants to get in touch with Kelly to do any potential one-on-one work with her. So everyone, good luck. Good luck. I hope
Yeah.
you know, your students prepare if they are kind of close to that 200 index, and that they do well in this fall's PSAT.
Yeah, me too. And thanks so much for joining us.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. Good night, everyone.
Thanks.